Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Today we're going to do a little bit of an interesting topic. To many of us, it might seem fairly obvious because of the way we've been conditioned to practice and behave, and it's kind of part of our culture as Jews. But today we're going to kind of look at the controversy that surrounds that common practice and then substantiate the practice. And namely, I'm referring to the fact that we visit the resting place of holy sages, Rabbis, Tzaddikim of past generations. We visit their holy resting places, their graves, and we pray there. And it's a fairly obvious and common practice amongst many, many Jews, but we should know that it's somewhat controversial. And there are many circles, certainly used to be, and I imagine there's probably still are many today, that would decidedly not do so. So we're going to look first at some of the sources that marginalize the practice or even outright, I don't want to say forbid it, but certainly lean towards discouraging the practice of going to visit the resting place, the graves of Tzaddikim and the righteous. And then we're going to look at some of the more classic sources from the Gemara themselves, which substantiate our practice of actually going and praying there. And we're going to get into the nature of the prayer itself from the halachic perspective. So let's begin. And here you can see on the screen the source sheet. So wherever I can find English translation, I did, so that way you can read along. And so at the beginning, it's going to be a little bit of dry halacha, but then as we go along, you'll see some really fascinating stories from the Talmud in this regard. So the first source that we're looking at in terms of those discouraging the practice of visiting the resting place of those who have passed is the Rambam Maimonides. So if you're looking at the English here, it's the Rambam towards the end of his 14-volume Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah, the laws of Avel, the laws of mourning. So the first two paragraphs here, he begins just describing the technicalities of the burial. And then he says, the third paragraph here, markings are made on the graves. A tombstone, right? A tombstone is placed in the grave. Now he says, for the righteous, by contrast, a tombstone is not placed. No reason to place a tombstone. Why? Because their words will cause them to be remembered. They don't need a piece of stone to remember the righteous. A person will not need their words, meaning the Torah that they left behind, the books that they've written, and that which they've taught, that will cause them to be remembered. No need for a physical stone. And therefore, a person will not need to visit the cemeteries. So here, Rambam doesn't say one cannot go, but he's discouraging the practice, saying there's no reason. You want to connect to the Tzaddik, you want to connect to the one who has passed on, read something he's taught, learn some of the things he has taught in his lifetime, read his books, be inspired by what he has taught or what she's taught, and that's enough. You don't have to go to the cemeteries at all. So this is not an outright prohibition, but certainly discouraging of the practice, even though he does say that markings are made, but for the righteous, no need. Okay, perhaps we'll see later why, at least we'll see perhaps why it is that for those who are not righteous, you do have to make a tombstone, while for the righteous, you don't have to make a tombstone, at least in the Rambam's view. But for now, we're focusing on the fact that the Rambam concludes the statement here by saying a person will not need to visit the cemeteries, as if to say, no reason to do so. You want to connect to the righteous, learn something they've taught, or learn something they've written. Now, in a similar vein, I'm only selecting samples of many, many, many writings, both for and against. I'm just selecting samples so we kind of get an idea. Here, this comes from the Bach. He's known as the Bach because, not the musician, but Bach is because his magnum opus, his writing, is a commentary on the Torah. The Torah is one of the foundational code of Jewish laws, and he has a commentary called the Bayis Chadash, the new house. And the two letters of the first word, the first letter of the two words, Bayis Chadash, make the word Bach. So commonly in yeshiva, he would be referred to as the Bach. But here you can see his name, Rabbi Yisrael Circus of Poland. And he writes as follows. So he's actually commenting on the laws of vows. Someone who's taken on vows and when they can be nullified and how they are fulfilled. And he writes as follows: Misha Nada Leilach B'Sek Faras, one who's taken a vow to go visit a cemetery, or a mikvah, or he took a vow that he's going to go to mikvah. The Iraloi, and it so happened to this person, Shahalach, it so happened that they happened to make their way into a cemetery, not because they intentionally went there, they just were planning, they just happened to be going through. So says the Bach, he's fulfilled his obligation of his vow to go to a cemetery. Then he says like this. This comes from the Chuvas Maharil, Simin Kuf Yud Ches. This comes from the response of Maharil. We'll have occasion to see text from the Maharil himself soon. And the rabbi referring to the Rama, Moshe Isserles, who wrote glosses on the Code of Jewish Law written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. Those glosses are the Ashkenazic customs that are glossed onto the Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who is predominantly Sephardic. So there, the Rama, Moshe Isserles, would commonly quote the Maharil, who lived some centuries before him, who is famous codifier of Ashkenazic custom, an early codifier of Ashkenazic custom. We'll read some of his text soon. And this little passage is quoted, this little passage that someone who ends up walking into a cemetery after taking a vow to go to a cemetery has fulfilled his obligation in that accidental entry, that is mentioned in the Code of Jewish Law in Rama's glosses. Now, on the subject of going to a cemetery, says the Bach as follows. I also saw a responsa, in the name of Rabbi Chaim Paltiel. I'm not sure who that is. But this responsa says as follows. Those who take vows to go visit cemeteries, it would seem somewhat it seems as if they are, quote, violating the prohibition of the Torah, a very serious prohibition, which is to, Dodesh Alamesim means to seek out the counsel of those who are dead. This is a serious prohibition. We'll look at the Rambam in a second, how he defines that prohibition. But this is a prohibition in the Torah, not to seek out the counsel of the dead. Now, the exact parameters of this prohibition is not exactly clear. We'll see in a moment from Rambam. But going to a cemetery isn't outright a violation of those prohibition. But this response that the Bach is quoting says it seems like he is violating his prohibition and therefore should be avoided. Then he goes on to say, now the Kalev shenishtach akivei avos. Now Kalev, who is one of the spies who go into the land of Israel, there's 12 spies, one representing each tribe that go into the land of Israel, sent by Moshe Rabbeinu. 10 come back with a negative report, and 2, Yeshua and Kalev, come back with positive report. And the Gemara says, and we're going to look at the passage in the Gemara later, that Kalev went to pray at the resting place of our forefathers in Hebron, at the Ma'arat Machpelah in Hebron. So that would seem to be a source indicating that you can go to graves and pray, because you see Kalev did it, and the Gemara quotes that as a commendable practice. So why would it then be a problem for someone to go to a cemetery, and why would that indicate that it looks like he's violating the prohibition of counseling with the dead? So he explains, Hispal l'sham l'shem b'makim kedusha. He didn't talk to the dead. He didn't talk to the one who's in the grave. He talked to God. But because of the holiness of the place, considering that here there lies righteous people, he's asking kadeshit tehei tilas nishmas, so that his prayer is more better heard on high in merit of the holy ground that he's standing on, but not because he's communicating with the one who passed away. As the verse states with respect to Avram, that Avram prayed at the place in which he got there. Alma, this implies that the location a person is standing to pray has an effect, which is why even if a person is praying alone without a minyan, it's still good to pray in a synagogue. And likewise, even at home, one should have a designated place of prayer as if this is a holy place, because the place itself in its holiness contributes to the prayer. And therefore, we're limiting. This is what the Bach is saying here. And this is what many will agree with, as we'll see going forward, that we are limiting the practice of going to the cemetery and going to visit the graves of the righteous, the graves of tzaddikim. We're limiting it to talking directly to Hashem and speaking to Hashem and saying, in merit of the tzaddik before whom I stand, in merit of this holy ground in which the tzaddik lies, I'm asking you, God, to hear my prayers. but not that we are communicating directly with those who have passed away. This is, on not the ones who outright forbid it, but kind of are limiting the practice. And he continues. Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, who's now being quoted by the Bach, continues. Inami, another reason why perhaps Kalev will have gone to the grave of our forefathers when he was spying out the land. Shabiza Sames. He's saying because the spies are being an embarrassment to those who have passed on, and therefore he's going to visit them to pay respect, but not because he's actually communicating to them. And therefore it continues, but various women and people who don't understand properly why they're going to a tzaddik's grave. And they might inadvertently communicate to the tzaddik. Again, these are the people who are opposed. We're going to see soon sources that substantiate the notion of talking to those who have passed on. But for now, we're looking at those who are in the camp that says not to do so. And therefore, this commentator, the Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, writes, these people who don't know this, who don't understand that the reason to go to the grave is just to pay respect or to talk to God and say to God, on behalf of the holy ground that I'm standing on where these righteous are buried, that's why I'm asking you to accept my prayer. So if they don't know this, I don't know why it is that they go frequent these graves, and I don't know why they frequent visiting the resting place of the righteous. And therefore it continues. And it's my custom that I find some way for them to regret their vow. They said they're going to go visit the grave. And I tell them to, I release them from the obligation of their vow. In other words, this commentary is saying, I prefer that they didn't go because it's too subtle for them, for the average person who hasn't learned and doesn't understand that you don't talk directly to the dead because it looks like it's the violation of the commandment. You're talking to God on behalf of the one, or you're talking to God and asking God that God listen to your prayer because of the holiness of the place that you're in. It's too subtle, and therefore I discourage them from going. And if they've taken a vow, I find some way to release them from their vow. And he encourages them and says, better give to charity, that which you would expend on your journey to get to the holy resting place. And then moreover, give extra money, the cost you would spend on going, and then the exertion, give money for what, the exertion cost, as it were. Give it to charity, be not some tzaddik, and that will save you from whatever predicament you're in. Atkan, end quote of the Bach, quoting this Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, who discouraged the practice of going to graves because one has to understand the subtlety of what one's doing there, and one should not actually communicate to the one who's passed on. One should rather speak to God and ask God that in the merit of the righteous that are lying here, please answer me. And because it's so subtle, therefore it's my practice, says Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, to discourage it and release anyone from any vow, anyone who has taken a vow to go to visit some holy resting place, and I tell them to give charity instead. But then the Bach himself says, Miyu, however, it's already become a practice people go. And therefore you can't stop them. And therefore, they can rely on that which it says, B'Sefer HaZohar in the Holy Zohar, where there it does talk about the importance of going to those who have passed on, going to the graves. But he concludes, but specifically when they go, they should keep in mind that they're going to the resting place of our forefathers to speak to God, for whatever calamity that might be on the people, that the people might be facing. And they're speaking to God, and the merit of our forefathers who are resting here, you should please answer our prayer. Something and the like. And there's already been established some sort of order of what people say when they go to these resting places. The English and no rabbi has the authority to uproot such a custom. But nonetheless, the Bach seems to side with the opinion of Rabbi Chaim Paltiel that when one does go to a grave, one is not talking to one who's passed. One is talking to God and asking that God hearken to our prayer in the merit of the one who is lying here. Okay, so here we have the text of the Rambam, which just defines what this prohibition, right? Rabbi Chaim Paltiel says that he doesn't want people communicating to those who have passed on because it looks like they're violating the commandment, they're violating the prohibition of Derish Alamesim, they're violating the commandment of seeking out those who have passed on. So let's look at the Rambam's definition of that prohibition. And it'll kind of give us at least a broad stroke of what this issue is, even though that's not the topic of our conversation, but it's a related topic. So, quote Rambam in the laws of idol worship, because this is a form of idol worship that existed in pagan era, where people would communicate with those who have died in a kind of bizarre ritual, as we're going to see. Who is the one who seeks information from the dead in violation of that prohibition? A person who starves himself and goes to sleep in a cemetery so that a deceased person will come to him in a dream and reply to his questions. There are others who wear special clothes, recite incantations, burn a particular type of incense, and sleep alone so that the deceased person will come to them and speak to them in a dream. To summarize, anyone who performs a deed in order that a deceased person should come to him and give him information is liable for lashes. As states, there shall not be found amongst you one who seeks information from the dead. So it's not exactly clear as to what exactly the parameters of this prohibition is. We're going to see there are those who disagree with this broad definition, and those who limit the prohibition of communicating with the dead specifically to specific acts, like he says here, wearing certain clothing, reading certain incantations, burning certain incense. Others limit it to only if someone sleeps on top of the grave, literally sleeps on top of the grave overnight. Others say that it's only a question of if you're communicating to the body rather than if you're communicating to the soul of the one who's passed on. There are different ways of understanding exactly this prohibition, but the general broad strokes is that there is a prohibition with seeking out counsel from those who have passed on in this sort of cultish ritual. Let's just put it that way. And therefore, going back to the previous text, Rabbi Chaim Paltiel says, don't communicate with the dead, because even if you're not in actual violation of this prohibition, it looks like you are. And better, what you should be doing is talk to God directly and ask God to have mercy upon us in the merit of the one who is lying here in this grave. Okay. We're going to look at 3 more texts. Okay, so we're not going to look at every single word because it's going to take too much time. But here you can see the Maril. We quoted the Maril before. We mentioned him. Rabbi Yaakov Levi Olin of Germany. He's an early codifier of Ashkenazic practice. And as I mentioned before, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Rabbi, who has glosses on the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, was written by Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who predominantly leaned toward the Sephardic tradition. So Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, the Rabbi, lived in Prague. Was an Ashkenazic halachic authority, wrote glosses on the Shulchan Aruch to kind of give the Ashkenazic custom. And oftentimes, very often, the Rama is quoting from the Maril, who's an earlier collector of Ashkenazic custom. But we're just going to look at the last line here, last 3 lines here, where you can see why the cursor is pointing. He's talking about the practice to go visit he's talking about the practice to go visit the graves after on fast days. And he says, and those who visit the graves of the righteous on fast days, and pray, he should not put intention towards those who have passed on, who are lying there. Because that's not how you communicate to. You don't communicate to those who have passed on. Rather, he should request from God that God should have mercy upon him in the merit of those who are lying here in the ground. Again, a very similar sentiment to the Bach, that you don't talk to the dead directly, you talk to God on behalf of those who are lying here. And similarly, this is the Mishnah Berurah, the famous Chofetz Chaim of Poland of the 19th, 20th century. He's quoting the Code of Jewish Law. He's quoting actually the Ramah, who quotes the Maril we just read. And he says, where there it says this custom to visit the graves on fast days. And their Mishnah Berurah comments, Shall Yisrael visit Jewish graves, so that they should ask God for mercy upon us. So now he adds a detail here. It's not only that we're talking to God directly, that God should have mercy upon us in the merit of those who are lying here, but actually those who are lying there, the dead themselves will pray for us. But he doesn't make any mention of us communicating and asking the dead, please go talk to God on my behalf. He doesn't make mention of that. He just says that our presence being there will elicit that those who are lying there, those who have passed, will beseech God on our behalf, but not that we're actually directly communicating. And then he even says, if there's no Jewish graves, you could even go visit non-Jewish graves. Why? To say to God, here we are fasting, and we're like, it's as if we're dead to you, as if we're nothing. We're worthless. We're lying in the ground. Please God, respond to us. Okay, so again, a similar kind of sentiment, but he adds a little nuance there. The point being that in the view of these scholars and many others, one does not communicate to the dead directly, one talks to God. At best, just the very fact that I'm there elicits from those who have passed that they should talk to God on our behalf, but not that I'm actually communicating to those who have passed. And now we have one more text that goes in this kind of line. And this is a very similar sentiment to the Rambam, which we quoted at the beginning. Rambam at the beginning says that a person shouldn't frequent cemeteries at all, which is why he said that the righteous don't need to have any tombstones, because if you want to connect to the one who has passed on, read something they wrote, get inspired by their teachings. You don't have to go to the grave. You don't have to go to their grave. Now the Gra, the famous Gra, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi here you can see a Vilna, contemporary of the founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe. There's history there. So now he wrote a letter, a very famous letter, which he wrote to, I believe, his wife and his mother before he was planning on going on a trip to Israel. It's not clear if he was planning on returning or if he was planning on going and never coming back to Poland, to Vilna, I'm sorry. But he wrote a long letter to them. And this letter, to a large degree in many circles, is kind of the foundation for the way Orthodox Jews may educate their daughters. Because here he's talking to his wife and his mother. I think maybe his daughter's also talking to them about how they should behave while he's gone. And he says, it's quite an interesting letter here. And again, I don't want to read the whole entire thing, but it's interesting practice because it's not common practice today, so far as I know. Maybe there are circles where it is a common practice. But for example, he writes here, concerning solitude, the main thing is to remain at home. I'm telling this to them. Even your visit to the synagogue should be very short. In fact, it is better to pray at home, for it is impossible to be spared from jealousy or from hearing idle talk or lashon hara in the synagogue. Too much chatter, women are conversing, people are jealous of each other, everybody's gossiping. Don't go to synagogue. This is obviously not the way many would practice today, but this is his view. And one receives punishment for this, meaning for gossip. As we find in the Gemara, one who hears and then is silent, meaning if you hear negative speech and you don't protest, you're culpable as well. So therefore, better not put yourself in that compromising situation by going to synagogue. This is even more so on Shabbos and Yom Tov when they gather to chat. It is better that you don't pray at all, meaning it would be better you don't pray than go to shul and hear all the gossip. It's quite the position. And again, this is not necessarily common practice, and many obviously have different way of practicing, but this is his view. And then he has this line here: refrain also from going to the cemetery, especially women, as it leads to all kinds of sorrow and sin. So here we see a very strong terms. The Gerab, the famous Vilna Gaon, writes to avoid going to a cemetery. He's not going to say it's outright forbidden, because as we already noted earlier, we're going to see soon, there are Talmudic texts beginning with the story of Kalev. One of the spies who went into the land of Israel, one of the two spies who came back with a positive report, went to go pray at the resting place of our forefathers in Hebron. So he can't say it's forbidden, but he's saying, better don't go. Similar to that which we saw at the beginning from the Rambam, which wrote, a tombstone was not placed by contrast. For the righteous, by contrast, the tombstone is not placed because their words will cause them to be remembered. A person will not need to visit the cemeteries. No reason to go there. Okay, so this is one view, which kind of divides, I guess, into two categories. One is outright discouraging going to cemetery. And the second view would be, if you're going to go, you're talking to God directly. You're not talking to those who have passed. You're talking to God, and you're asking God to hear your prayers in the merit of the ones who are lying here in the grave. But now let's look at the classic sources, the actual Gemaras, which they're all quoting. And let's see the wording of the actual stories in the Talmud to see if indeed they avoid talking to those who have passed, or perhaps, as we shall demonstrate quite clearly, they actually do communicate directly with those who have passed on. And which would substantiate the other view and our practice, which we do go to visit the graves of those who have passed on. We do go to visit the resting places of Tzaddikim, and we do ask the Tzaddik directly, please pray for us. We do speak directly to the Tzaddik, and the sources we're about to read will substantiate that claim. But before we did that, I want to just show you the other side. Okay, so this is the Gemara, the Talmud in Saita, which reads, it is also stated with regard to the spies, the 12 spies. This is the story we kept on mentioning about Kalev. And they went up into the south, and he came to Hebron. Why is the phrase, and he came up, written in the singular form? Seemingly it's talking about all 12 of them. And they went up into the south. And then it says he, in the singular, came to Hebron. So only one of them went to Hebron, one of the 12 spies. The verse should have said, and they came to Hebron, talking about all 12. Rava therefore says, this teaches you that Kalev separated himself from the council of the other spies. 12 spies went south, yes, but only one of them went to Hebron, specifically Kalev, and went and prostrated himself on the graves of the forefathers in Hebron. And he said to them, didn't say to God, he said to them, he said to the forefathers, my forefathers, pray for mercy for me so that I will be saved from the council of the spies. So here it's quite clear from the story that Kalev is not just going, as we read before, the Bach quoting Rabbi Chaim Paltiel, which said that when Kalev went, he was talking to God on behalf of the holy place because of our forefathers that are there, such a holy ground. So he's asking God to listen to me in the merit of the holy place that I'm in. But the story doesn't go that way, as the Talmud puts it. The story goes, as we read it here, he said to them, speaking directly, not to God, but to our forefathers. My forefathers, pray for mercy for me so that I will be saved from the council of spies. So this is a clear indication that it is permitted. And not only permitted, but it's a good practice to go speak to those who have passed on and say, please, our forefathers, please have mercy please speak to God so that we can pray for mercy for us. And the Gemara goes on to say why Yeshua, who was also one of the two spies who came back with a positive report, did not go to Hebron. It's only the singular, the verse says, only Kalev, because Yehoshua was already prayed for by Moshe Rabbeinu. So Moshe already prayed for on behalf of Yeshua that he be saved from the council of the spies who came back with a negative report. And Kalev went and prayed to spoke to our forefathers, asking them that they have mercy upon him so that he'd be saved from the council of the spies. So here we have primary source number one of Kalev, way back. The first time any Jew post-Exodus enters the land of Israel, one out of the two people who come back with a good report is because they went to speak to our forefathers who had already passed on centuries earlier. That's source number one. Source number two, this comes from a book called the Enyakov. The Enyakov is a collection of all the midrashic parts of the Talmud. But the Talmud has many laws. It also has sections of the Talmud that are midrashic, stories, elaboration on the verses, midrashic in nature, and they've all been collected in the Enyakov. Now, the Enyakov's version of these midrashic texts are sometimes slightly different than the way the texts appear in the Gemara as we have it. So therefore, they're both, knowing which one is the correct version is hard to know, but they're both studied almost as independent, valid works because of their different versions. So in this text, the Enyakov reads as follows. It's a very fascinating text. Rabbi Chana son of Chanina says, why was it that God made that the grave of Moshe Rabbeinu is hidden from the human eye? Why don't we know where it is? Right? The verse states explicitly, no one knew where Moshe Rabbeinu, where Moses is buried. And here the Enyakov is asking, Rabbi Chana son of Chanina is asking, well, why is that? Why don't we know? So says the Enyakov, because it is well known to God that one day the temple is going to be destroyed. And the Jews will be in exile from the land. And when the Jews are exiled from the land at that very moment, instead of marching to Babylon, they'll march straight to the grave of Moshe Rabbeinu, and they'll stand there crying, and they will beseech Moshe. And the Jews will say to Moshe, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, stand up and ask and pray for us. And what's going to happen if the Jews do that? And Moshe is going to stand up, pray to God, and the whole decree of exile will be nullified. Because the righteous are more precious to God post-life, in their death, than they are in their life on the physical earth. For you indeed find, when the Jews were in the desert, and the Jews messed up and they built the golden calf. Hashem got angry at the Jewish people. And God tells Moshe Rabbeinu, allow me and I will destroy the people. How many Jews, how many righteous people were living in that generation when the Jews did the golden calf? How many pious ones? Moshe, Aharon, Yeshua, Eldad, Medad, Shibim Zakanim, the 70 elders, the Shar Chacham and the other scholars, the Talmidim and the students. And all of those people couldn't stop God from destroying the people after the golden calf. The only one who is successful in dissuading God from destroying the people is Moshe Rabbeinu. So if Moshe Rabbeinu is capable of stopping God from destroying the people, and this is in his lifetime true, then certainly in his death he's capable of stopping any terrible decree that would happen to the Jewish people. And therefore, says Rabbi Chama Bar Chanina, if the Jews knew where Moshe Rabbeinu was buried, then the moment exile starts, Jews would march straight to Moshe Rabbeinu's grave and say, Moshe Rabbeinu, beseech God to stop this exile. And Moshe would do it, and God would have to stop the exile. And therefore God decided, I'm not going to show the Jews where Moshe Rabbeinu is buried. It's quite a remarkable teaching, and requires a lot of explanation to understand what this means. Why would God prevent us from finding some way to stopping the exile? Obviously, in God's plan, exile needs to happen for some reason, and Moshe Rabbeinu praying to him would have stopped it. Specifically, if we go to Moshe Rabbeinu's grave and ask him to please stop it. But the reason why we are quoting this here is because here we see the Gemara does speak directly. Again, another source, which tells us that speaking to those who are lying in the grave is appropriate and good, because the Jews could have done that had they known where Moshe Rabbeinu's grave is. That's source number 2 from the classic text of the Gemara, backing up this idea that we can speak to those who have passed on. First from Kalev, who speaks to our forefathers and says, please pray for me that I don't fall into the trap of the spies. And quote number 2 is that had we known where Moshe Rabbeinu's grave is, we would have certainly gone to pray to ask him to pray for us, and he certainly would have been successful. Source number 3, another wild story. The Gemara is like this. And furthermore, this is the Gemara Untitled. And furthermore, the Gemara relates that Rabbi Mani, Rabbi Yonah's son, was persecuted by members of the house of the Nasi. The Nasi is the prince of Israel, the Jewish leader at the time. This is in the second half of the second temple, roughly, or maybe a little bit after the second temple also, but before the Jews are exiled into Babylonia, into Babel. At that time, there is the Nasi, the house of the prince, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the famous Nasi, leader of the Jewish people. So it would seem that the court, the members of the household of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi were bothering Rabbi Mani, son of Rabbi Yonah. So Rabbi Mani wanted this to end. So he prostrated himself upon his father's grave. He went to go visit his deceased father, Yonah, and said to him, Father, Father, these men are persecuting me. So one day, those men were passing there. They were walking by the grave of Rabbi Yonah, father of Rabbi Mani, by the grave, and the legs of the horses became stuck in the ground. And they were stuck there until they accepted upon themselves not to persecute Rabbi Mani anymore. So here we see a scholar, a sage, Rabbi Mani, who's going to communicate to another scholar, his father, Rabbi Yonah, and saying, please, Father, can you intervene to help me out over here? And Rabbi Yonah does. The next time these people are bothering him or walking by Rabbi Yonah's grave, Rabbi Yonah makes that their horses can't move until they take it upon themselves not to bother Rabbi Mani anymore. Text number 3 from the Gemara itself, where we see scholars communicating to sages who have passed on already and successfully doing so. One more story in that regard. This is also a very, very interesting story, and if you have time, I encourage you to look up this Gemara. Brachot 18b. The Gemara has a number of stories that involve spirits of those who have passed on, quite remarkable, mind-blowing stories. And the Talmud there is discussing whether or not those who have passed on are aware of what's happening in this physical world. That's what the Gemara is discussing. Are people who have passed on aware of what's happening in the physical world? And the Gemara goes back and forth quoting different stories that substantiate one side or the other. And here the Gemara is citing this story as a proof that those who have passed on are aware of what's going on in this world. And this is the story. The Gemara cites another proof. Again, we're proving that those who have passed on are aware of what's happening in this world. And here's the story. Come in here as it is told. They would deposit the money of the orphans with Shmuel's father. Shmuel's father's name was Abba. Abba meaning father, but his name was actually Abba. And his job was to collect money for orphans, for safekeeping. That's what one of the things he did. He had a fund, and people would give him money, and he would support the orphans. Now, when Shmuel's father died, Shmuel was not with him. He passed away and his son wasn't there. And he did not learn from him the location of the money. So Abba passes away. The money that he collected for the orphans is somewhere, and nobody knows where it is. So since he did not return it, because the money didn't go back to the orphans or didn't go back to the people who donated, right? Because nobody knew where the money was. Shmuel was called, his friends would call him, son of him who consumes the money of orphans. They were kind of like looking at him and saying, you know, your father didn't have foresight to tell you where the money is. He was the only guy who knew, and he dies. Now the money's gone. So they refer to Shmuel as the son of the one who consumes money of the orphans. You know, you take the money and you take it to the grave, literally. Well, not literally the grave, but he took the information of where the money is to his grave. So what's Shmuel going to do? So Shmuel went after his father to the cemetery. So he went to go visit his father's grave. And he said to the dead, he didn't speak to his father directly. He went to the cemetery as a whole. And he said, I want Abba. Tell me where my father is, whose name was Abba. The dead said to him, there are many Abbas here. We can't help you. You got to be more specific. So he told them, he's talking to all the dead there that are in the grave. And he tells them, I want Abba bar Abba, Abba son of Abba. They said to him, there are also many people named Abba son of Abba here. So he told them further, I want Abba bar Abba, the father of Shmuel. You know, this itself is interesting, why he has to go through all these stages. Why doesn't he just say straight up, I want my father? Good question. I don't know the answer. But this is the story. He says, I want Abba, and those who have passed on say, too many Abbas around. Be more specific. He says, I want Abba, son of Abba. Still not enough. He says, I want Abba, son of Abba, father of Shmuel. And he says, where is he? So they replied to him, okay, ascend to the yeshiva on high. Right? There's a yeshiva up in heaven. Go there and you'll find Abba. You'll find your father. Now, meanwhile, he saw his friend Levi, who had passed away sometime earlier, sitting outside the yeshiva, away from the rest of the deceased. So his friend Levi is not in the yeshiva on high. On his way up to go find his father in the yeshiva on high, this is all obviously spiritual movement, but this is the story. So on his way up to go to the yeshiva on high to find his father, he sees his friend Levi not in the yeshiva. So he asked his friend, why did you sit outside? Why did you not ascend to the yeshiva? Like, why aren't you in there learning with all the other scholars who have passed on? He replied, so Levi explained why he's not in the yeshiva now. Because they tell me that all those years that you, meaning I, didn't enter the yeshiva of Rav Afas, and thereby upset him, will not grant you entry to the yeshiva on high. So Levi explains that while I was living, I was disrespectful to Rabbi Afas and his yeshiva. And because I was disrespectful to Rabbi Afas and his yeshiva, they won't allow me to the yeshiva in heaven. Now, meanwhile, Shmuel's father comes, you know, Shmuel's on his way into the yeshiva. I guess Shmuel's father knows that his son is looking for him. So he comes to the entrance of the yeshiva to meet his son, where he's sitting there, where Shmuel is conversing with his friend Levi, trying to find out why he's not in the yeshiva. So Shmuel's father came, and Shmuel saw that he was crying and laughing. His father in heaven, coming from the yeshiva in heaven to greet his son, is both simultaneously crying and laughing. Shmuel said to his father, why are you crying? And so his father replied to him, because you are coming here soon. I'm crying because you're passing away soon and you're going to be joining me here in the yeshiva. So Shmuel continued to ask, well, then why are you laughing? So his father replied to him, because you are extremely important in this world. So I'm very sad that you're leaving that world, but it's also very delightful that you're going to be joining me in this world. So I'm both crying and laughing. So Shmuel now said to his father, if I am important to the yeshiva that I'm about to enter after I pass on, then let them grant Levi entry to yeshiva. He's throwing his weight around. His father just informed him that in the yeshiva on high, he's an important figure. So he says, okay, if I'm an important figure, then I want to defend my friend. My friend here is stuck outside the yeshiva. Please grant him entry. And so it was that they granted Levi entry into the yeshiva. Thanks to Shmuel, who's still alive in the physical world, who went to visit heaven. Now he gets his friend who passed away years earlier to be entered into the yeshiva. Now Shmuel said to his father, where's the orphan's money? This is why he came there. The reason why he came here is because he wanted to know where the money was. His father collected money for the orphans, and his father died and no one knows where the money is. So he asked his father, where's the orphan's money? So he said to him, Shmuel's father Abba tells his son Shmuel, go and retrieve it from the mill house. Where you will find the uppermost and the lowermost money, the uppermost and the lowermost money is ours. And the money in the middle belongs to the orphans. So go there, you'll find 3 stacks of money. The middle one belongs to the orphans. The rest of it's ours. So Shmuel now said to his father, why did you do that? Why did you put the money in such a position? Half money on top, money on bottom, money in the middle belongs to the orphans. So Abba explained, the father explained to Shmuel, if thieves stole, they would steal from our money on top, which the thief would see first. If the earth swallowed up the money, any of it, it would swallow up from our money on the bottom. So in other words, a way of protecting the orphan's money by putting it in the middle. And if anything happened to the money, it would happen to the money on the outside first, and therefore protecting the money of the orphans. Apparently, the dead, in the case of Shmuel's father, know when others will die, right? Because he tells his son Shmuel, you're going to be joining me here soon. Since Shmuel did not die the next day, clearly the angel Duma could not have informed them. The Gemara responds, perhaps Shmuel is different because he is so important, they announce beforehand clear place. The Gemara is concluding that not necessarily is it a proof that universally the souls on high know what's going on down here. It could be it's a special case for Shmuel because of his status. But the reason why we're learning this Gemara is because clearly here, Shmuel is communicating with the dead. Here he is talking to his father, asking his father for advice, and settling issues up in heaven, getting his friend Levi entering into the yeshiva, asking his father information about where money is in this physical world. So here's another proof text which indicates clearly that there is not only no problem, but a good thing with communicating to the dead and asking them to speak to God on their behalf, or even just asking them directly, like we saw the story with Rabbi Mani, who asked his father Yonah, please help me from these people who are bothering me. And Yonah interferes by having their horses stuck there until they agree not to bother him anymore. So again, another source substantiating our practice. Okay, we're running short on time, but let's just look at there's 3 more sources to go on this whole subject. So following all of these sources we just quoted, these classic texts of the Gemara, there are many halachic authorities who indeed therefore rule that one may and can go to the graves of those who have passed on and should speak to them directly and say, please, pray on my behalf. And the first here is the Shalah, famous Shalah, Rabbi Yeshaya Horowitz. You can see here of Prague, died in 1630. Yeah, here he cites the story of Rabbi Mani and the story of Kalev as proof that one can indeed speak to those who have passed on. And likewise here, this is another Gemara, this is another commentary from the Yavitz of Yaakov Emden, the famous Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Germany. He's quoting, he's commenting on the Gemara, which says that there was a certain scholar, Reish Lakish, who had Mitzayin Marta de Rabbanon. He would make demarcations indicating where the sages' graves are. And the question is why he's doing that. Why is he doing that? So one way of understanding the reason why he's putting demarcations where the graves are is that a Kohen would know where to walk and where not to walk, because a Kohen cannot become impure. And walking on a grave would make someone impure. And therefore it's important to to note where they are. But the Yavitz says it's not the real reason. And he says, the reason why, nearly, it seems to me, the reason why he's making demarcations to indicate where the graves of the righteous are is that people should know, and they should come and pray by their graves. That's why it's important to have demarcations to note where the righteous are buried. And these people will come and inform those who have passed on, to inform them of any problems or any things that are happening in the community, and that they should, on high, pray on our behalf. So this is again another source, halachic source, based on the sources we quoted earlier, that state that one can communicate directly to those who have passed. And then he introduces another story, which we don't have time to get into, but it's a fascinating story. There was a sage named Rabbi Bina, Marta, that he himself also was demarking the locations of the various different graves. And there, it's a fascinating story. He came to the Marta Machpelah, and he was demarcating the location of where our forefathers are buried in Hebron. And there he saw Abraham and Sarah in a position that he thought was compromising. And he was told by someone there that in this place there is no evil inclinations, so you don't have to worry about it. And he goes and he meets the forefathers, and he meets Abraham, and he meets Yaakov, he meets other Manish. Very fascinating story. But the point is here to give it tzaddikim the graves of the righteous, ka'avis, like our forefathers, v'adilem etamim, do not confer impurity. And therefore, there's no reason to make demarcations of where the righteous are buried if you're trying to prevent impurity, because impurity is not imparted by the righteous. This itself is a controversial statement, but this is his position, that the graves of our forefathers do not, such righteous like our forefathers, their graves do not infer impurity. And therefore, there's no reason to make demarcations to inform of where impurity is, because there is no impurity by the righteous. Ella, rather, nafkamina, the reason why he is making these demarcations is because the Amran has to be noted, so that people can go there and pray. As we find the story of Kalev that we quoted earlier, where Kalev went, that he went and prostrated himself and prayed at the graves of our forefathers, and many such stories are found like this in the Talmud, where people go and speak to those who have passed, and we've read above a number of those stories. And finally, we have the Minchas Alazar, the famous Munkach Rebbe of Munkach, Ukraine. I'm not going to read the entirety of the thing, but essentially he writes that the text we quoted earlier from the Maharil, that early German Ashkenazic codifier of Ashkenazic custom, where he says that when one visits the grave on a fast day, one should not put his effort and attention to those who are lying there, but rather put his attention to God, that God respond to him on behalf of those who are lying here. So he explains that the Maharil didn't mean that you don't talk to those who have passed on directly. That's certainly a fine and appropriate thing to do. What the Maharil meant was that you shouldn't assume that those who are lying there have some independent power other than God. The whole power that these tzaddikim have is a godly power. And therefore don't think that they have some power separate and that they can do it and you're not, like God's out of the picture. No, you're talking to those who have passed on, but they are eliciting God's power. They're eliciting God's strength to answer your prayer. But not that there's a problem to talk to them directly, but only there's a problem to assume that they have some power that's independent of God, God forbid. And then he goes on to say a very interesting point, which I'm not going to read the actual text, but basically the point is as follows. He cites to a responsa from the Chassam Sofer, famous responsa, in which the Chassam Sofer, Moshe Sofer of Hungary, he writes that Moshe, I think his name was Moshe, who writes that why is it that the halacha is you're not allowed to ask an angel to speak to God on your behalf. If you met an angel tomorrow morning, you would not be allowed to tell the angel, can you please speak to God on my behalf? And the reason you can't do that is because Jews don't have intermediaries. You don't ask an angel to speak to God on your behalf. You talk to God directly. You have your own connection to God. Now, the Chassam Sofer asks, well, then, if that's the case, how could any Jew pray for another Jew? Forget going to those who have passed on, even just another living Jew. How does any Jew pray on behalf of another one? Is it not asking for intermediary? And he explains that all Jews are one large spiritual body. He quotes the Talmud, and this is an idea that we find in chapter 2 of Tanya, and chapter 32 of Tanya. We find this idea that all Jews are one large spiritual entity. And just like in a physical body, when my mouth communicates to the doctor and says, my finger is hurting me, it's not my mouth speaking on behalf of this other party called my finger. My mouth and finger are one person. And my mouth communicates what the finger is feeling. It's not intermediary. The finger's best way of communicating is through the mouth. And the same thing is true of having the righteous pray on our behalf. In this great large body of the Jewish people, the righteous, the Rebbes, the Tzaddikim, they're like the mind and heart of the Jew. And therefore, when the Tzaddik speaks to God, it's not like he's speaking on my behalf and I'm a third party. But my best way of communicating to God is through the mouth of the Jewish people, is through the Tzaddik. Just like the best way for my finger to communicate to the doctor is not for it itself to communicate, but rather that my mouth communicates, that my mind communicates through my mouth. So likewise, the Tzaddik is like the mouthpiece and the mind of the totality of the Jewish people. And if when the Tzaddik speaks to God on behalf of the Jews, it's not an intermediary, it's an extension of the Jew himself. In fact, it's the best extension of the Jewish people, being the heart, mind, and mouth of the entirety of the Jewish people. And therefore it goes on, quoting this Chassam Sofer, the Munkach Rebbe goes on to say that certainly, as we quoted earlier from the Enyakov, that greater are the tzaddikim after they passed on, greater they are than when they were alive. And certainly you can ask those who have passed on to speak to God on your behalf, because they're an extension of me. They're part of the same one great spiritual body known as the Jewish people. All one great spiritual body. And therefore when a tzaddik even one who has passed on, speaks to God on my behalf, it's not another entity speaking in the middle, but it's like my mouthpiece speaking for me. And therefore, he encourages the practice of going to the graves of the righteous, going to the resting place of the righteous, and speaking to them directly and asking them to communicate to God all that is distressing the people or all that is good for the people. And this kind of gives us an idea of the controversy surrounding visiting the resting place of tzaddikim, and then finally substantiating this custom based on these Talmudic stories that we saw earlier with Kalev, with Rabbi, with Rabbi Shmuel and his father, and other such. These are only samples. There are other such stories like this scattered throughout the Talmud. So thank you all for the opportunity, and thank you all for listening. And have a wonderful rest of your day. If you have any questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask. Okay, I guess that's it. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.